So in honor of that, we will start with some practice. So encourage you to just find any way to sit that feels good for you. Upright if that's possible. And also just relax, settling in. You all came out here in the cold to sit here in community. So just setting this intention that for this 15 or probably about 15, maybe 20 minutes, just to be deeply here. Letting go of any conceptions of being a meditator or having to be anyone at all, having to do anything, having to go anywhere. And we can all settle in with a few longer, slower, deeper breaths. Whenever you feel ready, allowing the breath to return to a natural rhythm. Just recognizing right now, wherever you notice the rhythm of the breath, whatever comes easy or natural. And this will be the through line or the thread that kind of weaves its way through this meditation. Just also allowing the thinking mind, any perceptions or planning, to just fall to the background. Whenever it comes up, just acknowledging that, letting it go, coming back to this rhythm of breath. Softening the body around the upright spine. Or whatever way sitting feels good or comfortable for you. Noticing the muscles of the forehead. Is there any tension or holding? Similarly, the muscles of the mind, the thinking mind, relaxing. Letting the eyes relax in the sockets. Letting the jaw just gently drop, and even the tongue. We'll pay kind of a little extra special attention to the shoulders, particularly in the winter when they can become habitually raised, tight, or tense. What does it feel like to allow them to just fall back naturally? Shoulder blades coming together a little bit. You can open up the front of the chest and the belly. Feeling the weight of the arms. What does it feel like to just allow gravity to bring them to a rest? Feeling the energy of the body moving down through the arms, through the torso, softening through the chest, stomach, abdomen. Say strong back and soft belly, upright but relaxed. And this opens up this whole emotional center and just breathing in a sense of ease, attitude of kindness. Connecting to the cushion and the mat, feeling the weight of the sit bones, the body connecting to the cushion. Breathing into the thighs, upper legs, the lower legs, and all the way down through the feet and the toes. Just noticing the quality of the mind now. And the quality of awareness itself. Just letting that receptive quality of the mind, which is present, just to rest on a global sense of the body. So the whole body and the rhythm of the breath. Every time the mind trails off, gently returning, bringing it back. Such a simple practice, but such profound implications for the mind. A sense of agency in what is happening in the mind. Not controlling or pushing anything away, but just gentle return. Just noticing if there's any quality of stress in the mind. Just in a really simple way, acknowledging if there's any quality of tension or grasping or wishing something was different. Sometimes this layer of the mind can be quite subtle. So just bringing an attitude of curiosity. Noticing if there's any film or layer of resistance in the mind to experience as it is right now. This kind of cold room, kind of the end of perhaps a long day. Just noticing and bringing this really simple attitude of curiosity and knowing, recognizing, and also recognizing this deep potential for release in the mind. One of of the reasons we use the breath as an anchor is to provide the mind with a sense of steadiness. So using that rhythm of the breath to see if it's possible to drop any added friction to experience. Maybe that's a softening in the body, a releasing of an over-efforting. Making this practice as simple as you possibly can. Noticing what these small moments of release can provide. Especially in the midst of a weekday or so much busyness. Just these small moments of space, of non-doing. Recognizing that the mind and the heart can have a reference point of release, of openness. What would it feel like if this awareness was as wide as this room right now? It's wide open. Giving your mind all the room it needs. And holding yourself with a generous, open, and spacious awareness. Some of the words or metaphors for nirvana, or freedom, in Buddhist teachings are unrestricted, unconditioned, unbounded, and deathless. What does it feel like to turn the mind towards this potential for release? Unconstricted. Wide open. Spending this last minute just taking in a really simple attitude of kindness, of appreciation. This beautiful capacity of being human, to have gratitude, to simply be here and just to breathe. While you all are so still and quiet still, I want to read a quote. What we generally call understanding is knowledge, an accumulated memory, an intellectual grasping of a subject according to given data. This is called knowing accordingly, anubodha. And it is not very deep. Real deep understanding of penetration, pativeda, is seeing a thing in its true nature, without name and label. This penetration is possible only when the mind is free from all impurities and is fully developed through meditation. It's from a Buddhist monastic, Walpala Sri Rahula. And it gets to this really interesting idea of form of wisdom or understanding, which is kind of non-conceptual in a way, a deep knowing in the mind and the heart, which can go beyond label, a deep knowing and a wisdom which comes through releasing the mind from certain patterns. And so at the heart of this topic of wise understanding is a deep, personal, I guess, facing of truth, of experience inwardly. And as I said at the beginning, it acknowledges the very real suffering that can happen in this life, the added layers of suffering that the mind often adds to experience. The cause of that being for some thirst in a world of impermanence and change, the mind grasping and trying to fix or fixate onto something. The potential for the mind to release and find this deep freedom called cessation or nibbana. And then the idea, the fourth truth being that it's possible to cultivate a path, a holistic kind of a path which leads in that direction. And so this isn't meant to be like commandments and this is the only way to do this, but it's something which is participatory and invites an investigation of really personal way of experience. It's meant to be a framework of looking at experience. And it's something I found so helpful over years to continually come back to this really simple teaching in a way. particularly when I'm suffering. And then also noticing, as we did when we went around earlier, noticing when the mind's not suffering. Also important. How does the mind find happiness and this deep freedom or peace? So rather than truths, the lens I kind of want to take today is like tasks, things to be explored. And we're going to use some of Tuere Sala's teachings. She has a blog, and for January and February, she wrote about these first two truths. So I want to share some of her quotes and her perspective in honor of Black History Month. And she's absolutely one of my favorite Dharma teachers out there right now. She's a really lovely person to listen to. So I'll talk more about it at the end. I'll share some resources and how to find some of her teachings. So she says, it doesn't take much to see suffering, right? But this is not the suffering the Buddha was pointing towards. Buddha was pointing to something much subtler, much harder to see. It's not that obvious as losing an election. There's something else at play that causes us to suffer. It takes a great deal of practice and perseverance to see it. In fact, you have to want to see it because our natural underlying tendency is to not see it. Our basic human brain or nervous system prevents us from seeing it. With practice, however, we begin to see something. The more we practice, the more we see. And the more we see, the less we get caught by this underlying tendency. It's a really great quote. And she goes on to talk about in her blog how the way she's come to see this kind of first task or truth of noticing suffering as almost like a film or a layer that is added to experience. And I really appreciated that metaphor, and I found it immediately something I could reflect on personally. It's very evocative in a way, this idea of the mind kind of adding this layer of suffering to experiences. And as the teaching almost always says in Buddhist teachings, it's not the experience itself which is the suffering, but it's the relationship to the experience that causes the suffering. And so the experience of suffering can be unique, and it can vary quite a bit, whether it's about the election or health or relationships. I know any of you who are in the health or helping professions, we get to see all varieties of this. But the idea is that there is actually a mechanism of suffering that is the same in all these varieties. And this is this added layer of film or pain, which happens in the mind. And it's a sense of resistance or grasping, and oftentimes ignorance, not knowing that the mind is actually doing that. And so the task in this really simple way of this first task is really just to see it in the first place, even to recognize that the suffering that I'm experiencing at times, it's not just the experience, there's this added layer. And so the task is to see that clearly. And this is sometimes the hardest part because it can feel so embedded in experience at times, particularly when it comes to like really habitual forms of suffering. So the second noble truth says that the source of suffering is craving. Tuere says, we look for this reliability in everything that is inherently unreliable. It's unreliable because we cannot control outer conditions no matter how much we want to. Left unchecked, this constant unreliability creates within us a constant agitation, a restlessness that external conditions will never be able to settle. This is because external conditions are constantly changing without regard to our individual situation. Genuine reliability and stability comes from within. The more we see what we are holding on to and learn to let go, the freer we become. So does that feel familiar at all? Some of that really resonated to me, particularly the constant unreliability the constant agitation. It's kind of, and I think for me often it's quite subtle. It's not always this big existential suffering, but a layer of resistance that I notice in my mind as I move through the day. So the word for craving is tanha in Pali, which means thirst. And it's kind of this idea that there's this thirst that really has no quenching to it. It never ends up fully quenched. It's looking for something that doesn't exist, looking for reliability in conditions which are inherently unreliable. So the practice here is to also see not just the suffering, but also how the suffering arises, the source of it, through this thirst or craving. She goes on to say, we live in a closed loop system that is guarded by our ego. This ego keeps us locked in a system of understanding, assumptions, information, memory, concepts, beliefs, etc., that were established when we were very, very young. And it imprisons us within itself. So this is a metaphor I've heard her use before, and I like this idea of a closed loop system that the mind is operating within, and that can be really difficult to see. There's a very subtle attachment to the perceptions of the mind. And in particular, what I found helpful about that is a couple words: locked, that it's locked, and also the assumptions. There's these assumptions the mind assumes so often that the way something is perceived is actually the way it is. So this is often the thing that fuels rumination or conceit or hatred or resentment, sense of being locked and locked into assumptions. And also greed, stereotyping, racism, homophobia, some of these larger cultural issues that are really devouring society. It all starts in the mind. And it happens through misperceptions, delusional perceptions, and assumptions which are held to as fixed beliefs. So the way out is releasing the mind from this thirst through this practice of mindfulness, particularly mindfulness which is immersed in the body. Gives the mind some stability, gives the nervous system some room and some space. So the third noble truth is that the mind can touch into something where it does not push, it does not pull, it does not attach. This is the release, the great promise of Buddhist teachings, and an important part, because I know it starts with suffering. And often Buddhism kind of gets this rap for being overly focused on suffering, but it's only to acknowledge how it happens and how to become free from it, which is really important. And that really, this is a path of deep joy and freedom and peace. And so when the Buddha was asked how he crossed the flood towards freedom, he said, when I pushed forward, I was whirled about. When I stayed in place, I sank. And so I crossed over the flood without pushing forward and without staying in place. It's great kind of beautiful metaphors that are so embedded in Buddhist teachings. So the idea that it's possible for this mind to find a sense of release called cessation or nirodha, and it almost comes from a non-doing in the mind in a way. And I want to bring it really down practical rather than being a far off, distant place, but something that can be touched in the here and now within every time we sit down to do this practice. In the very simple mechanism which happens over and over again in the mind, watching the mind trail off and bringing it back. Gentle training of the mind, and each moment it's exercising a sense of agency and freedom and saying, my intention is here, and starting to free the mind from some of this perpetual grasping, trying to fix or manage or control something. And this can also can happen in the heart, as we talked about earlier, when the heart can become free from a deep resentment. Just noticing that it's possible for that to happen. And then what is left when there's an old wound that gets healed, or a mending with someone that you've been in conflict with? What does that leave the heart? My own experience is that it leaves space. It leaves room. Less occupation and preoccupation in the heart. So what I was trying to get to in the meditation today is the possibility to discover this quality of the mind, which is really spacious, which is really open. Sense of kind of like, some breathing room. And I found that in my 41 years of trying so many different things to be happy, this is one of the most reliable things. I don't know if you can call it a thing, but reliable form of happiness, because it's not fabricated. It's not like the mind is trying to create something. It almost rests into something which is just open and effortless. And so we can practice this by cultivating the space in meditation, returning to the breath, returning again and again. And so this sense of space for the mind can become a reference point. And so when I watch my mind getting pulled into a pattern of thought, a sense of resentment, whatever it is, instead of coming back to a distraction or another idea about what's happening, it can just come back to a sense of space, which allows for a deeper presence of the mind and a deeper ability, for me anyways, I can speak, to move through my day without having to feel like I need to hold up something or prop something up all the time. So that sense of space, in a weird way, can become a really helpful reference point. And this is one of the reasons why we train with the breath in meditation and develop concentration, to familiarize the mind with that sense of openness and spaciousness. So the final fourth truth is what's called the Eightfold Path. And the idea, really simply put, is that there's a path which can lead to an end of suffering. And I don't know how that lands for you. I don't know, maybe from some people it could feel doubtful, maybe inspiring. But it's something that we will explore over the next 8 weeks, actually, through various teachers I'll go through. And this wise understanding is the first factor of this kind of whole 8 path. But roughly it's in 3 categories. 1, developing wisdom through this wise understanding, through developing an intention of kindness, through also cultivating a sense of virtue, through speech, through action, through livelihood, through work. Generally speaking, not causing harm is surprisingly supportive for the mind. And then finally, through meditative concentration, mindfulness, and a wise effort, a balanced effort. So those are some of the topics we'll get deeper into as we move through. So today, as I said, was the first factor, wise understanding. And it's just this really simple 4 tasks or truths, however you want to look at it. Acknowledging this added layer of suffering, which comes through resistance or grasping, and that it's possible to free the mind from that pattern and discover something which is really deeply unfabricated and freeing, and that there's a path of cultivation which helps support the mind to develop. So I'm going to end with one final quote from Tuere, and then we'll open it up for some discussion. She says, "Finally, as we begin to see this craving and start letting it go, we need to recognize that we are letting go of craving. Sometimes it feels like we just don't get irritated by something that used to irritate us. That's no small thing. We can't make ourselves not get irritated with something that irritates us. If we notice that we're not irritated, we need to acknowledge that we have abandoned craving in that moment. Also, if we don't get upset when something doesn't go our way, again, we can't make ourselves not get upset when we want something to go away. To recognize that we're not upset is a recognition that craving has been abandoned. Lastly, if we're able to just let something we really enjoy come to an end, that is a moment of craving being abandoned. So offer that for your reflection. Thank you for listening. And we'll open it up for some discussion.